My name is Juliet Anderson, and I'm 28 years old. I was only 7 the first time my father called me a liar in front of our family. We were celebrating my aunt's birthday when I accidentally knocked over a glass of juice. I tried to explain that it had slipped from my hands, but my father simply looked around the table and said, "She always says that. Nothing is ever her fault." The room filled with laughter. I didn't laugh. In that single moment, something inside me quietly broke. I realized that my parents had already decided who I was, and nothing I ever said would change their minds. For the next 21 years, I spent my life trying to prove them wrong. I chose my words carefully, dressed the way they expected, apologized even when I wasn't at fault, and slowly reshaped myself into someone I barely recognized, all in the hope of earning a kind of love that always stayed just beyond my reach. Then I met Callum Reed. Callum was 31, a civil engineer with calm hands and an even calmer heart. We met 3 years ago at a rooftop charity fundraiser. He had come to support a coworker, while I was attending for one of my clients. Within minutes, he accidentally spilled his drink all over my jacket. The apology that followed was so genuine that instead of getting upset, I laughed. By the end of the evening, we had exchanged phone numbers and shared a conversation that felt like taking my first real breath after years of holding it in. For the first time, I was with someone who never expected me to shrink myself. He wasn't intimidated by my honesty. Whenever he asked a question, he truly listened to the answer instead of waiting for his turn to speak. 14 months later, Callum proposed in the kitchen of our apartment. There were no fireworks, photographers, or elaborate surprises. He simply knelt on one knee, holding the ring his grandmother had left him. His voice trembled slightly as he said my name. I didn't even let him finish the proposal before saying yes. We planned our wedding for a Saturday in late September. The rehearsal dinner was scheduled for the Friday night before, in a private room at Brennan's restaurant. Candles glowed across every table, surrounded by the people we loved most. For me, it wasn't just another celebration, it was the first time in my life I truly felt chosen. My parents, however, had never approved of Callum. My father, Leonard Anderson, believed Callum was too quiet, too reserved, and not nearly impressive enough to meet the impossible standards he carried in his mind. My mother, Patricia, smiled politely whenever Callum was around, but the moment he stepped out of the room, she filled the silence with whispered criticism. By then, I had learned to ignore their opinions. Years of experience had taught me how to separate their voices from my own. But 2 weeks before our wedding, they crossed a line I could never ignore. On a Tuesday afternoon, Callum called me. The moment I heard his voice, I knew something was wrong. He wasn't angry. He sounded painfully careful, like someone carrying a fragile piece of glass that could shatter at any second. He quietly told me that my parents had shown up at his office without warning. They had sat across from him and claimed that when I was 22, I became pregnant, gave birth to a baby, and then abandoned that child without ever looking back. My father even called the baby a bastard. My mother leaned closer and whispered, "Don't let her trap you too." Callum never raised his voice. He didn't accuse me or demand explanations. Instead, he simply asked, "Is there anything you need to tell me?" I was sitting alone inside my car in a parking garage, gripping my phone so tightly my fingers hurt. His question made it feel as though the ground beneath me had disappeared. There had been a pregnancy. But everything my parents told him was a lie. When I was 22, I had been dating a man named Sebastian Cole. He was older than me and carried himself with effortless charm, but beneath that polished appearance was someone who thrived on control. When I discovered I was pregnant, I was terrified. Sebastian made it painfully clear that he didn't want the baby. Every time I tried to talk about my fears, he made me feel smaller, weaker, until I questioned whether my own feelings even mattered. I carried the pregnancy for 4 months before everything ended in a miscarriage. It happened suddenly, and it shattered me. There was never a child I abandoned. There was never a baby I walked away from. There was only overwhelming grief, a grief I buried so deeply that I rarely spoke about it, not even to Callum. I never found the right moment to share something that painful. That chapter of my life belonged to a younger version of myself who had already suffered more than enough. My parents knew every detail. My mother had driven me to the hospital herself. She had sat beside me in the waiting room and held my hand while I cried. She knew exactly what had happened. She also knew exactly what hadn't. Yet only 14 days before my wedding, she looked my fiancé in the eyes and falsely told him I had abandoned a living child. That night, I went straight to Callum's apartment. For the first time, I told him everything. I told him about Sebastian. I told him about the pregnancy. I told him about the miscarriage. I told him about the years of silence and the pain I had hidden from almost everyone. He listened without interrupting. When I finally finished, he reached across the table, gently took my hand, and quietly said, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that." He didn't say, "Why didn't you tell me?" He didn't ask whether I was telling the truth. He simply mourned that loss with me before asking a single question. That was the man I was about to marry. Still, the poison my parents had poured into the situation lingered between us. Even with all of Callum's kindness, I knew doubt could leave scars that love alone couldn't always erase. My parents understood exactly what they were doing. They believed that if they planted enough suspicion just days before the wedding, it might grow into something that would destroy us from the inside. What they never expected was who would walk into our rehearsal dinner the following Friday, or what she would bring with her. The rehearsal dinner was meant to be the peaceful beginning of an unforgettable weekend. Brennan's restaurant looked breathtaking. Warm amber lights glowed against exposed brick walls. Long tables were covered with elegant cream-colored linens, decorated with fresh eucalyptus runners and dozens of flickering candles whose soft light reflected gently across the smiling faces of our closest friends and family. Across the room, Callum stood near the bar beside his brother, laughing at something that had just been said. His tie was loosened, the top button of his shirt was open, and before long, his eyes found mine from across the room. Every few minutes, Callum's eyes found mine from across the room, just as they always did. It was his quiet way of making sure I was okay, reminding me without words that I wasn't facing the night alone. Standing in the doorway wearing my navy dress, I allowed myself to believe, if only for a second, that the pain of the previous 2 weeks had somehow faded, that my parents hadn't tried to destroy my future, and that the wounds they left behind had already healed. They were seated at the far end of the table. My father, Leonard, was already working on his second drink. My mother, Patricia, wore a soft rose-colored blouse and the carefully practiced smile she reserved for public occasions. To everyone else, she looked warm, elegant, and welcoming. I knew better. That smile had always been a performance. They had called me twice after confronting Callum. I ignored both calls. They were only there because I hadn't found the strength to tell them they were no longer welcome. A small, exhausted part of me had hoped they would simply sit quietly, let the evening pass peacefully, and leave without creating another painful memory. That hope disappeared at exactly 8:17 p.m. The private dining room door opened, and a woman stepped inside whom I hadn't seen in 6 years. Her name was Nora Voss. She was 34, slender, composed, with dark eyes that carried the unmistakable calm of someone who had survived life at its worst. During my relationship with Sebastian Cole, Nora had been my closest friend. When I lost my pregnancy, she stayed beside me through every unbearable moment, holding me together when I barely recognized myself. Over the years, we slowly drifted apart. There had never been a fight between us. Sometimes people simply grow distant because every conversation reminds them of a chapter they both struggled to survive. I hadn't invited Nora. I didn't even know she was coming. For a few seconds, I could only stare, unable to understand why she was there. She walked straight toward me, ignoring the greetings, the conversations, and the curious faces around her. "Juliet," she said quietly, her voice calm but urgent. "I need 5 minutes. It can't wait." In her hands was a large manila envelope. Without asking any questions, I followed her into the hallway outside the private dining room. The sounds of laughter and conversation faded as the door closed behind us. She handed me the envelope. "Open it." Inside were hospital records. There was my discharge paperwork from the hospital. A letter from the attending physician. Medical documents confirming that I had suffered a miscarriage at 17 weeks. Every page carried dates, signatures, and official records that proved exactly what had happened all those years ago. Beneath those documents was another stack of papers. Screenshots of text messages. The conversation was between my mother, Patricia Anderson, and Sebastian Cole. My hands began to shake. The earliest message had been sent 3 months earlier. My mother had contacted Sebastian directly. She asked him to tell anyone who questioned it that I had delivered a healthy baby and secretly placed the child for adoption without telling him. For all of Sebastian's many flaws, he refused. He replied that it wasn't true. He told her that was never what happened and made it clear he wanted nothing to do with the lie. My mother kept pushing. She sent 2 more messages trying to convince him. Eventually, he stopped replying altogether. Nora quietly explained everything. Sebastian had become deeply uncomfortable with the conversation and reached out to her because they had remained loosely in contact over the years. The moment she saw those messages, she knew I deserved to have them before I stood at the altar. She had driven for hours just to place that envelope in my hands. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the papers. What I felt wasn't anger. It reached much deeper than that. It was the unbearable sadness that comes from finally holding proof of something you've always known in your heart, that the people who were supposed to protect you hadn't simply made mistakes. They had chosen cruelty. Every lie had been calculated. Every manipulation had been intentional. It had never been about protecting me. It had always been about controlling me. After taking a slow breath, I walked back into the dining room. Before I could say a word, Callum looked at my face, immediately understood something had happened, and quietly stepped beside me. He didn't ask questions. He simply stood there. Together. I placed the envelope in the center of the table directly in front of my parents. Around us sat our closest friends and family. The candles still flickered. The eucalyptus decorations still filled the room with their gentle fragrance. Everything looked beautiful. Only the truth waiting inside that envelope threatened to shatter the evening. I didn't raise my voice. For too many years I had wasted my energy shouting into rooms where no one wanted to hear me. This time, I spoke quietly. Clearly. Confidently. I explained exactly what the documents proved. I told everyone how, only 14 days before my wedding, my parents had gone to my fiancé with a completely fabricated story, hoping to destroy our relationship with lies they knew were false. My father clenched his jaw. My mother stared silently at the tablecloth. Neither one denied it. Neither one spoke. When I finished, I looked at them and said only 4 words. Please leave. Right now. Without another argument. They stood. And they left. For several long seconds, the room remained completely silent. Then someone slowly began to clap. It was Callum's mother, Frances. From the day we first met, she had treated me with nothing but kindness and respect. Her applause started softly. One pair of hands. Then another joined. Then another. Within moments, the entire room was applauding. I stood there beneath the warm amber lights of Brennan's, holding Callum's hand while tears blurred my vision. Across the table, Nora smiled through tears of her own. As the applause surrounded me, it seemed to erase every painful memory of being called a liar in rooms where nobody had ever defended me. That Saturday, we got married. The ceremony was small. Simple. Honest. It belonged entirely to us. You build a life so strong, so honest, and so full of genuine love that their lies no longer have anywhere to live. And if you've ever sat quietly while someone rewrote your truth, while everyone else stayed silent, I want you to remember this. The rehearsal dinner isn't always the ending. Sometimes it's the place where your real life finally begins. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join us again. Every story we share is meant for someone who needs hope, healing, or the courage to keep moving forward. The next chapter might be exactly the one you've been waiting for.